the Gold Science Committee, a current chair of the European Respiratory Society Airway Pharmacology Group, and the editor of the European Respiratory Journal and European Respiratory Review. So, colleagues, let's all virtually welcome Professor David Singh.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm delighted to give you this lecture today, the Respimat Reusable. I'm going to talk about how it impacts patients and, importantly, the environment. The Respimat Reusable lowers the carbon footprint, as you'll see in my presentation. So before I start, I'd just quickly like to show you my disclosures of interest. So I've called it the Respimat Reusable, and I want to explain to you the key characteristics. I show you on this slide the Respimat that we're all used to giving to our patients, and also the Respimat Reusable. I'm going to go through this in detail. You'll see that this reusable device, now you're able to put a new cartridge into there. You can actually do that up times. This has improved handling and usability, not based on what doctors think, but based on what patients think. And I'm going to show you all this information in great detail. So here's an overview of the features of the Respimat Reusable. Now, some are the same as the current Respimat, or the one that's been used for many years, and some are different. If I take an overview, then one of the key advantages of the Respimat in general is the fact that the dose generation is slow. The particles delivered are fine, less than 5 microns, and this slow delivery of fine particles without a propellant therefore makes the drug well deposited throughout the bronchial tree, but in a carbon-friendly manner, because there's no propellant with its potential to damage the environment. The aerosol generation, therefore, is independent of the inspiratory flow of the patient. The patient doesn't need to take a fast breath in, which you do with a dry powder inhaler. Now, I've just said that there's no propellant and the patient does not need to take a fast inhalation. That makes it a unique device. You'll see later on that I'll talk about how dry powder inhalers without propellants can reduce the carbon footprint. Here you have a mist inhaler that in some ways could be seen as similar to a metered dose inhaler, but actually it isn't, because there's no propellant, and that makes it a lot more environmentally friendly. Those features are very similar to the Respimat that we're used to, the previous version. So what are the new features? Well, being able to replace the cartridge then makes the life of the device much longer. There's a dose indicator that's been put into the device. The sustainability of this multi-dose device then is a key advantage. There are many features outlined here that patients have identified that they like about the Respimat Reusable. It's compact, it's portable, you don't need any priming. There's patient feedback to tell you that you've taken a dose because of the dose indicator. So that's an overview. So let me just repeat. The device, in terms of the mist, is exactly the same as the previous version in terms of concept. A low velocity aerosol. It comes out slowly. The duration is over 1 second. This means that patients don't have to rush. If there's a fast velocity, patients often will take a fast inhalation. And a fast inhalation then will lead to more impaction in the upper airways. With this mist inhaler, a slower inhalation leads to a more homogeneous deposition throughout the airways. And then this slow inhalation then doesn't require patients to reach a certain inspiratory effort, which you require with a breath-activated device. So these are all features that you're used to, and they are retained in the Respimat Reusable. Now, you might say that, well, look, there's lots of inhaler devices, and this becomes confusing. Well, let me repeat the text that's in the gold strategy document. The choice of inhaler device has to be individually tailored and will depend on access, cost, prescriber, and patient's ability and preference. And what you have here in the Respimat Reusable is a unique device that can be tailored towards patients. There is no other device like it. So while confusion might come when you have lots of similar devices, lots of similar MDIs and DPIs, let me stress this is a unique device. And now that we have the longer shelf life, repeated use, greener inhaler, lower carbon footprint, it makes the advantages even greater. So let's really get into the detail of the key new features of the Respimat Reusable. So again, just briefly, to reassure you that many features are the same. Now, generally, it looks similar, not quite the same, but generally looks similar. The dosing accuracy is retained. So the fact that you can insert a new cartridge and it can be used for a longer duration, you don't lose any dosing accuracy. The aerolization system remains unchanged. And the first time that you prepare and use the inhaler remains unchanged. So what's different then is the ability, after using the first cartridge, to replace it, and then to do that 6 times. 6 cartridges can be used. So in detail then, there's an exchangeable cartridge, and the new cartridge has a dose indicator. So this is what I meant earlier, that the patient gets feedback. I'll show you the dose indicator in a bit of detail. So up to 6 cartridges can be used, and there's a cartridge counter. So all of this makes life easy for patients. They know exactly which dose they've had, because that automatically shows, and the patients can simply mark the cartridge counter, so you know exactly where you're up to. Now, this new device is a bit larger than the older device, and that actually, from patient feedback, patients tell us that it's easier to use, improved handling. So here's the dose indicator. There's different colors. There's a white color, a yellow color, and then when it's run out, you get a red color. So this gives you an ability to track when you need to insert the new cartridge, gives you dose feedback. Patients, they love this sort of thing. Inhalers that don't give you dose feedback, don't tell you when you're near the end, many patients find that problematic. Now, I've mentioned this quite a few times, but I think this is a huge advantage, a huge advance, being able to put refill cartridges into the inhaler. I've already mentioned the sustainability aspect, because the cartridge then is changed, but the rest of the inhaler device is reused. So therefore, this lowers the amount of waste material. Now, this cartridge counter It's very simple. Sometimes simplicity is best. You change the cartridge, you just mark on the surface on the cartridge counter that you've done that. So when you change the cartridge, you need to take out the clear base, detach the cartridge, and insert a new one. Relatively straightforward. The new device is slightly larger, and overall there have been some changes to the structure that makes this detachment, reinsertion of a new cartridge, and reassembly very straightforward. And here we show them in detail. Now you can see the top of the inhaler in a sort of darker color. So the cap, the mouthpiece, it's the same. In the light blue and in the orangey browny color, that's where you see the changes. I've talked about quite a few of these already. If we just look at the cartridge counter, the reversible cartridge lock, and that allows the cartridge to be changed, they're obviously new features. The clear base, the structure of it is different. There's a safety catch and a reversible device lock, and these are all new features, reversible being the key, that allow you to change the cartridges. So that's the technology. What do patients say about this? I presented to you the details of how the inhaler has changed, but it's important to know that patients would find this an advantage. So I want to take you step by step through a series of usability studies that were performed in the development of the Respimat Reusable. You could put this into three categories of tests. First of all, there was a formative usability test, and this was an overall evaluation of the inhaler's general handling and ease of use. Then there was a formative usability test 2, where the reusable device was compared to patients' previous experience. And then there were confirmatory studies that were, if you like, more required for regulatory purposes. Let's have a look at some of this data. You can see that 65 participants took part in the usability tests. There were healthcare professionals and 54 patients with obstructive lung diseases. 26 were Respimat naive and 28 actually had experience of using the Respimat device. So the usability study 1. You can see the scores here. 1, difficult, 7, easy. So priming the inhaler, 6.1. So easy. Inserting the new cartridge. So this was a key thing that would have been of interest. The actual reassembly, inserting a new cartridge, 5.7. The most difficult thing that patients found was removing a cartridge, but even then the score was 4.6, so nowhere near difficult. So all of this was very reassuring that patients are telling us that these new steps, inserting a new cartridge, removing a cartridge, identifying the need to replace a cartridge, so that's the dose counter, all of it at the easy end of the spectrum. In the usability study 2, the comparison was performed against the disposable Respimat, the previous version. So here you can see a scale that would either favor the reusable Respimat or favor the disposable Respimat. And you can see where the respondents were for the cartridge insertion process. 0 then would be neutral, that the two inhaler devices were equal, and the 4 participants gave that score. The rest of the participants for the cartridge insertion process all favored the reusable Respimat. Now that's interesting. And that comes back to the point I made earlier, that the handling characteristics of this new inhaler have been improved. Let's look at some of the other new features. Is the dose indicator easy to read? A very high score, 6.6. Is it easy to see how many doses are left? A very high score, 5.9. So if we take the actual reassembly part, when you're changing the inhaler step by step, so there's a clear base detachment step needed. So is it easy to understand? Is it practical? Is it intuitive? Well, the scores here are very high. Look at the mean values. You can see the spread of the data. All these steps for the clear base detachment, patients was scored very highly. Then what about the replacement with the refill cartridge? So there's different steps here. You pull the empty cartridge out, then you push the narrow end of the cartridge into the inhaler, and then you put the clear base back into place, and then an overall assessment. So there's 3 steps: removing, pushing it in, and then putting the clear base back into place. Look at the scores. They're self-explanatory. Patients found this relatively easy to do. So I've mentioned this a few times. The Respimat Reusable is bigger. And when you look again at the scores for whether this is an advantage for patients, 7, the same scale has been used throughout. 7 applies very much. 1 doesn't apply at all. You see that very high scores are obtained. And we've split it here into different categories of patients: men, women, short-term users, long-term users. And you're overall getting very high scores. So I've shown you different aspects of what patients say. So it's one thing me or another healthcare professional saying, I think this is good, I think it's fantastic. It's quite another thing when a patient tells you exactly the same thing. And that's what you've seen in the last few slides. So let me give you a sort of summary of all that. We've looked at some usability studies, and there are different processes involved in the Respimat Reusable that we asked patients to look at. And they identified an easier cartridge insertion process. The dose indicator is easy to read. There's a practical and intuitive clear base detachment. There's an easy cartridge replacement. And the bigger size overall makes it easier for patients. So let's move on. I want to now think about technical performance. This will be a short section, but focusing really on the particles, the aerosol delivery. There are different ways that you can look at this. You can look by laser diffraction and Anderson cascade impactor. The Anderson cascade impactor looks at the size of the particle at different stages of the airway. The Anderson cascade, in a way, mimics different airway sizes. Using these technologies, these are in vitro studies, you're able to look at the total delivered dose, so what comes out of the inhaler, and then from that, how much is what we call the fine particle fraction. And the fine particle fraction are particles that are less than 5 microns. So I've talked about a reusable inhaler where you reinsert cartridges. You'd want to know over time that the dose delivered is stable. You've reinserted a cartridge. I'm saying let's reuse this again and again. And you want to have in vitro tests that reassure you that the dose that patients are receiving remains stable over time. And for both the tiotropium component and the olodaterol component, you can see that as you change the cartridges, still the delivered dose stays in the same range as the beginning and in the same range as the disposable Respimat. So this is all very positive data in case you or your patients are worried that over time the inhaler is deteriorating, delivering less of the drug. This data shows you consistent dose delivery over time. And then here's data concerning the fine particle fraction at different stages. And these stages all represent different airway generations. And again, you have a reference, you have different, and the reference being the disposable inhaler, and then you have the reusable inhaler with up to 9 cartridges. So the tests have gone on further than what you would use in clinical practice. And it's fairly obvious that in different airway generations in this simulation, so stage 1 and 2 being larger airways, and as you get to stage 3, 4, 5, the airways get smaller, still the fine particle fraction deposited in each generation of airways remains stable over time and is highly similar to the disposable Respimat. So moving on, a different question to consider. So I'm proposing that there is a device that you could switch your patients to. Why not switch them to a reusable inhaler? So it's one thing doing a preference test for patients, but those patients were not using it in real life. What about patient satisfaction and preference if they were to use the reusable Respimat in real life? So here's a study then to look at patient satisfaction, performance, and of the inhaler and the convenience of the reusable soft mist inhaler in COPD patients, and 3 categories of patients. Those who were already using the reusable Respimat, those that were previously switched from a disposable Respimat, and those that had never used a soft mist Respimat device. So patients were enrolled. It's a big study, 20 sites across 6 European countries, 225 patients. You can see that how they split out in the bottom there. You can see that 131 patients actually were already using the reusable device. 69 were switch patients. They were on the disposable Respimat, and 55 had never used a Respimat device before. And then for 4 to 6 weeks, so this is the real life part I'm talking about, 4 to 6 weeks, they used the reusable soft mist inhaler, and then they returned for evaluation. And I'm going to show you different questionnaires. There's a patient satisfaction and preference questionnaire. Then there's an assessment of the performance and an assessment of convenience. So different ways of looking at patient preference and satisfaction. So here's the questionnaire that I was talking about. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because of time, but you can see that there's a performance domain. And this is really how the patients feel that the inhaler performs. And there's different questions there, and they grade them from 1 to 7. So a higher score is better. So there's questions there. What do you think about Does it work reliably? The ease of inhaler, the speed the medicine comes out, etc. Then there's a convenience domain. So instructions for use, are they convenient? Size of the inhaler, ease of cleaning, etc. And then there's a few overall questions. What's your overall satisfaction, your willingness to carry on with this device? And then this gives you a score from 0 to 100. So there we have it. Very high scores. Overall, around 80 or just above. And when you switch when you look at the different categories of patients, there doesn't seem to be much difference. The scores are also shown in a darker red for the overall score, but if you want to look at the performance or convenience domains, then they're shown here as well. And there's no real difference. Performance was high, convenience was high, and the overall score was high. So interesting data. Then if we look just at overall satisfaction, so a much more simpler scoring method where 7 would be very satisfied, 6 would be satisfied. So the redder colors are higher scores. The bluer colors would be somewhat satisfied, ranging to very dissatisfied. It's fairly obvious that about 90% of patients are scoring red. That's a 6 or a 7. Comes back to my point earlier that having gold, that inhaler choice is important for patients. Although I'm presenting to you many advantages of this inhaler, clearly it won't be for everyone, but it's interesting here that 90% of patients, and these are different patients. These are patients who've used Respimat before, some who've never used Respimat before. 90% of patients are satisfied or very satisfied with this device. Similar evaluation of the overall ease of handling, lots of red scores, approximately 90%, doesn't matter which group you look at, the switching group, the naive group, the overall handling scored very highly. So just focus on the switching cohort. I think this might be something that's informative for clinicians thinking about switching patients. Then 83%, nearly 84%, would prefer the reusable inhaler. 11% wanted to stay with their old device. Interesting. So if you want to switch patients, the vast majority will say, after 4 to 6 weeks, I like this new inhaler. Remember, those formative evaluations were done with patients sat in front of you using the device. The difference here, patients have gone into the real world, tested the device for up to 6 weeks, and come back, and 83% have said, I like this device more than the older version. And you've seen other data in the last few slides showing how highly this reusable Respimat scores in different domains. So lastly now, I want to wrap up by thinking about the environment, thinking about the carbon footprint. What are the benefits of the Respimat Reusable for the environment? This is something that we need to take sharp notice of. It's something that affects our lives in general. And inhalers, that's just one part of the carbon footprint issues that we face. And our job as healthcare professionals is to do our best to tackle this effectively. Before I get into the details, this is interesting that the Respimat Reusable has actually won an award, the Eco Design International Award for Sustainability from Formative in 2020. So clearly, there's independent recognition of the sustainability and lowering of the carbon footprint for this device. So let me just start with an overview of a product's carbon footprint. I like to think of this in three sections. There is the manufacturing and production of a device. I think you could put distribution in there as well. And when we think about inhalers, then it's everything that goes into making the inhaler and getting it to your patient. We're going to ignore distribution for a second, well, for the rest of this presentation, and look really at materials and production. That's one section. Then there's the use of the product. And for inhalers, I mentioned earlier, the problem comes with metered dose inhalers that have propellants, and propellants then contribute to greenhouse gases and increase carbon footprint. Just to repeat, this soft mist inhaler does not use a propellant. It's a unique device. Dry powder inhalers do not use propellants. So therefore, this soft mist inhaler could be considered, from the point of sustainability, more close to a dry powder inhaler than a metered dose inhaler in terms of sustainability because of lack of propellant. Then you have end-of-life recycling or waste treatment, etc. And clearly, the reusable cartridges that I've been talking about enhance the life of the Respimat. So three sections. There's the production of the inhaler, the use of it, and the end of life to think about. So product carbon footprint compared to HFA MDIs. So we have a couple of MDIs here, and then we have the Respimat inhaler here, and you can see the product carbon footprint is far lower for the soft mist inhaler compared to the metered dose inhaler. And one of the key components here then is the lack of propellant for the Respimat, 20 times lower. So where does the carbon footprint of the Respimat come from? And it's all clearly shown here. I think it's important that we as healthcare professionals have this information. 59% of it comes from the material acquisition and 32% comes from the production. So nearly all of it, 90%, comes from the manufacture of the inhaler. The lack of propellant then means the use has minimal carbon footprint, and then the end of life, by increasing the length of use by having reusable cartridges, you extend the period of time that the inhaler can be used by the patient, and this lowers the end of life carbon footprint. So that's shown here, the reusable design. So the longer that you can use the inhaler, it's rather obvious. You then lower the carbon footprint. So I want to look then at the 30-day product carbon footprints of some of the other inhalers that we use. And I've taken as an example some of the GSK products, because GSK have dry powder inhalers and they have metered dose inhalers. Now, clearly dry powder inhalers, I've mentioned this a number of times, and you of course all know this, that the lack of propellant then potentially lowers their carbon footprint. But you have to look at the other parts as well, the three components I'm talking about, the production, the use in the middle, and the end of life. So it's interesting as you look at dry powders here and you transition across the slide to metered dose inhalers, that you see the green for metered dose inhalers as a percentage then is a dominant part of the carbon footprint. Now, as you look more at the dry powder inhalers, it's more to do with the production and the end of life. So let's put this all together. I've now introduced the Respimat into this, and you have to look at the last column then, the 30-day product carbon footprint. The metered dose inhalers in the middle of this slide all have the highest carbon footprint. Then, when you look at some of the dry powder inhalers, it's much lower. So values like 0.8, 0.75. Now let's look at the 6-month Respimat Reusable, 0.23. If you look at the Respimat Disposable, it's 0.78, so it's rather like the dry powder inhalers. But the prolonged use of the Respimat Reusable over 6 months drops this even further. Now, I've used the word unique to describe this soft mist inhaler, and it plays out in terms of the greenness, the lowered carbon footprint compared to metered dose inhalers, and interestingly, compared to dry powder inhalers. And it's because of the long usability, because you can have 6 cartridges. Let's look at this in a different way. This is now a budget impact. I'm going to show you this in two different geographical regions. Here's the Nordics and Benelux. So it's interesting. It's a nice analysis, this. A world without Respimat Reusable in grey and a world with Respimat Reusable in blue. So a world with Respimat Reusable drops the number of inhalers, and then the costs associated with the carbon footprint go down. Now, this is really important data. Do you want an environment where patients every month, their inhalers give out greenhouse gases, and at the end of the month, they throw their inhaler away? Or do you want an environment where patients use inhalers that don't have greenhouse gases, propellants, and then reuse the inhalers? The Respimat Reusable, 6 cartridges. So here's UK data. My country, about 3/4 of respiratory inhalers prescribed are MDIs. Now, what if we converted this to Respimat Reusables? Well, the number of soft mist inhalers required would suddenly drop when we look at just the LAMA or the dual bronchodilator. And again, in line with everything I've said, the costs then would be reduced, the costs associated with carbon footprint, and the carbon footprint itself would be reduced. So I hope you've managed to get some valuable information from today for your practice. We've been through a lot of data. I'm going to just give you a short summary. In many ways, the Respimat Reusable has features of what you might call an ideal inhaler. The Respimat Reusable maintains key features of the disposable Respimat, particularly in terms of the fine particle fraction, the slow generation of the mist, the inspiratory effort independent nature of the drug delivery. But now there's an inhaler, the reusable, that's easier to handle. It has a dose indicator. You can replace cartridges easily, so it's a very simplified assembly. There's a dose indicator at the base, and patients can mark off when they use a cartridge. So I think this is a huge advance, not only in terms of patient preference and patient usability, but in terms of our contribution to maintaining the green environment that we want our planet to be. So thank you for listening, and now I'm going to hand back to our chairman.
Thank you, Dr.